During the 1st century BC, the political and military action of Gaius Julius Caesar was inextricably intertwined with the fate of Rome and the transformation of its institutional structure. The Gallic campaigns, which began in 58 BC, offered Caesar the opportunity to consolidate his position as a military commander and increase his personal prestige at home. The decision to go beyond traditional borders, not only crossing the Rhine to carry out demonstration expeditions in Germanic territory, but also to undertake the dangerous and uncertain crossing towards Britain, represented a step that historians still discuss today in terms of political opportunity, strategic utility, and symbolic impact. Britain was known to the Romans, but remained a distant and in many ways dark land. The information came largely from commercial relationships mediated by the Gallic populations and from unverified accounts. Later authors, such as Strabo and Dio Cassius, would provide more extensive details, but in Caesar's time Roman knowledge of that region was fragmentary and partial. Caesar himself, in his Commentarii, recognized the scarcity of precise information and underlined how the information was often contradictory. His expedition, therefore, was not only a military operation, but also a voyage of exploration that would fill a geographical and political void. In 55 BC Caesar made his first expedition to Britain, limited and marked by notable technical difficulties. The fleet, inadequately equipped for the tides and unstable conditions of the Channel, encountered great obstacles, and the landing occurred with more difficulty than perhaps the commander had anticipated. Despite the clashes with the local tribes, the operation was more of an exploratory and demonstrative nature. The following year, in 54 BC, Caesar undertook a second and more substantial campaign, this time with a larger fleet and more careful preparation. It was on this occasion that the Roman legions went beyond simple coastal contact and advanced inland, up to the River Thames, where they encountered the resistance of Cassivellaunus, one of the most influential leaders of the British tribes. Cassivellaunus, according to what Caesar reports, had assumed command of the defense operations thanks to the prestige accumulated in previous clashes with other local populations. He was not a king in the Roman sense of the term, but a military and political leader temporarily recognized by multiple tribes, often in conflict with each other. This form of authority, based on consensus and force, constituted one of the main weaknesses of the British resistance, which never managed to transform itself into a united and stable front against the invasion. On the other hand, the Roman army brought with it the experience of years of wars in Gaul, the iron discipline of the legions, the engineering and logistical capacity that had allowed Caesar to build bridges over the Rhine and impressive fortification lines around Alesia. Contemporary and later sources, although partial and sometimes celebratory, agree that the British expedition had great symbolic significance. Suetonius, in the Life of Caesar, underlines the audacity of a commander who brought the Roman insignia to a land hitherto never touched by the legions. Cassius Dio, writing over 2 centuries later, reconstructs the impact of the campaign with greater narrative color, but the main source still remains Caesar himself. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico, composed and disseminated to influence Roman public opinion, are at the same time a report and a political instrument. They insist on the effectiveness of operations, on the readiness of the commander, on the ability to maintain order despite difficulties. However, a critical reading also allows us to grasp the implicit admissions of the difficulties encountered. The storms that damaged the fleet, the supply problems, the fierce resistance of the local populations. The introduction of the campaign in Britain therefore takes place in a context of consolidation of Roman dominion in Gaul, of military experimentation beyond traditional borders, and of Caesar's search for personal glory. The advance towards the Thames was not an isolated episode, but part of a broader strategy which aimed to guarantee the security of the northern borders of Gaul and at the same time to project the image of Rome as an unstoppable power. The clash with Cassivellaunus takes on an emblematic value not so much for its tactical dimension, but for the political significance it had both for contemporaries and for posterity. The campaign showed the limits and possibilities of Roman expansion, revealed the resistance and originality of British tactics, based in particular on the use of war chariots, and marked one of the moments in which the myth of the Roman general was most consolidated. For this reason, the study of the battle on the Thames and of the entire expedition cannot be limited to the reconstruction of the clashes, but must take into account the political conditions, the dynamics between the local tribes, the nature of the sources and the interpretation that the Romans themselves wanted to give to those events. Only in this way is it possible to understand how the meeting between Caesar and Cassivellaunus became an integral part of the broader process which, in the following years, would transform Rome from a Mediterranean republic to an imperial power with projection on a European scale. When Julius Caesar, in 58 BC, obtained the proconsulate of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum and subsequently Narbonensis Gaul, he found himself faced with a situation that could have determined his political and military future. The Roman Republic was engaged in a period of strong internal tensions, marked by the clash between the factions of the Optimates and the Populars, and Caesar, fresh from a political career skillfully built through alliances and concessions, needed a theater of war that would allow him to emerge as a leading commander. The Gallic Wars, documented by himself in the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, represented not only a military adventure, but also a personal propaganda campaign, functional to consolidating consensus in Rome. His deliberately sober and apparently objective prose, but in reality calibrated to present every action as necessary and every victory as inevitable, constitutes the main contemporary source for the study of that period. By the time Caesar began his campaign, Gaul was divided into myriad peoples and tribes, often in conflict with each other and lacking true political unity. Some of them already had consolidated contacts with Rome, especially in Narbonese Gaul, while others viewed the Roman presence with suspicion or hostility. The episode of the Helvetii, who attempted to migrate en masse through Gaul in 58 BC, provided Caesar with a pretext for an armed intervention. The Roman victory in the Battle of Bibracte, reported with emphasis in the Commentarii, immediately showed the commander's ability to transform a security problem into an opportunity to legitimize his military action and to expand Rome's influence well beyond the borders established by his official mandate. From that moment, the Gallic Wars developed as a sequence of campaigns against the main populations of the territory, culminating with the Great Revolt led by Vercingetorix in 52 BC and with the Siege of Alesia, which remained one of the masterpieces of Roman engineering and military strategy. The state of Julius Caesar's campaign after the fall of Alesia was complex. Although the victory over Vercingetorix had represented a decisive blow for Gallic resistance, the territory was not yet completely pacified. Minor tribes continued to resist, and the vastness of the region required widespread control and the continuous presence of garrisons. Caesar was therefore in a phase of consolidation, in which he had not only to maintain order, but also to demonstrate to Rome that the conquest was stable and lasting. The decision to push beyond the traditional borders is part of this context, both in Germany, through the construction of the famous bridges over the Rhine, and in Britain, a territory hitherto unknown to the Roman legions. These operations had not only a military value, but also a symbolic and political value, aimed at impressing both Rome's allies and adversaries. From the point of view of military organization, Caesar's army had reached an extraordinary level of efficiency. The veteran legions, hardened by years of campaigning in difficult conditions, were made up of experienced soldiers, capable of adapting to different scenarios and disciplined to the point of executing complex maneuvers under pressure. Among his commanders stood out figures such as Titus Labienus, his trusted legate, who often played a decisive role in the Gallic campaigns, and Mark Antony, who later became one of the protagonists of Roman history after Caesar's death. These men represented not only the general's operational arm, but also a political and personal link to the future of the Republic. The hierarchical structure of the Roman army, with its legates, military tribunes and centurions, guaranteed precise control and an efficient chain of command, elements that constituted the fundamental difference compared to the adversaries, who were often disorganized and tied to charismatic but unstable forms of command. The enemies of Rome in that period presented very different characteristics from each other. Some Germanic peoples, such as the Suebi led by Ariovistus, had posed a threat early in the campaign and were defeated by Caesar with a combination of rapid maneuvers and legionary discipline. The Gauls, on the contrary, despite often having superior numbers, suffered from a chronic lack of cohesion. Only with Vercingetorix was there an attempt to coordinate the tribes in a united resistance, but the defeat at Alesia had shown that even a broader alliance was not sufficient to overcome Roman superiority in terms of organization, logistics, and military engineering. In Britain, the situation was even more fragmented. The sources, particularly Caesar, describe a patchwork of local tribes led by autonomous leaders, often in conflict with each other. Cassivellaunus managed to emerge as a figure of reference during the second expedition of 54 BC, but his authority remained limited and temporary, based on the need to oppose an external enemy rather than on a stable consensus. This structural weakness was one of the main reasons for Roman success. A fundamental aspect of the state of Caesar's campaign was the propaganda dimension. Every victory, every construction, every crossing of rivers or seas was presented in the Commentarii as an extraordinary undertaking, aimed not only at justifying the military action, but also at exalting the figure of the commander. When Caesar describes the construction of the bridge over the Rhine, for example, he emphasizes the speed and precision of the work, highlighting the Roman ability to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. In the same way, the crossing to Britain, despite all its limitations and difficulties encountered, was presented as the first time that the Roman banners reached those distant lands. This narrative was intended to strengthen consensus in Rome, where news of military victories was greeted with enthusiasm and helped build Caesar's image as the invincible general. From a political point of view, Caesar's position was increasingly delicate. In Rome, relations with Pompey and Crassus, his allies of the First Triumvirate, were changing. The death of Crassus in 53 BC and the growing tensions with Pompey led to a progressive isolation that would have decisive consequences in the following years. Victories in Gaul and expeditions beyond the borders were therefore essential not only to ensure military security, but also to keep Caesar's political prestige intact in the face of an often hostile Senate and a nobility ready to question his power. The state of the campaign, therefore, can be summarized in some key elements. The consolidation of the conquest of Gaul after the victory over Vercingetorix, the need to still control some rebellious areas, the demonstration of strength through operations beyond the borders, the growing experience and discipline of the Roman legions, the structural weakness of the enemies, and finally the propaganda dimension which transformed every military action into an element of political legitimation. It is in this context that Caesar's decision to face the British challenge and to compete with a new territory, populated by unknown people and led by leaders such as Cassivellaunus, whose name would remain linked to one of the most significant moments of his campaign, is placed. The analysis of contemporary sources allows us to better understand the state of the campaign in those years. The Commentarii, despite their evident apologetic purpose, represent direct and detailed testimony. Strabo, with his geography, provides complementary information on the territory and the populations, while Cassius Dio, writing in the imperial age, reworks with greater critical distance but with a perspective conditioned by the time that has passed. Suetonius, in the Life of Caesar, insists more on the anecdotal aspects and the personal figure of the general, but confirms the importance of the Gallic campaign as a springboard for his future rise. In this mix of sources and interpretations, the overall picture of a commander emerges who, starting from a strong but not yet consolidated institutional position, used the war in Gaul and the related expeditions to build a career destined to radically change the history of Rome. In the context of the Gallic Wars and expeditions beyond the borders, understanding the state of Rome's enemies and the condition of the Roman army means grasping the very substance of the balance of power in the 1st century BC. After the fall of Alesia and the surrender of Vercingetorix in 52 BC, Gallic resistance did not completely end, but was reduced to local episodes and sporadic revolts, lacking the capacity for coordination that had characterized the last great insurrection. The sources, in particular Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico, highlight how, after that date, the authority of Rome was recognized by an ever-increasing number of tribes, although there is no shortage of evidence of isolated rebellions such as those of the Andes or the Carnutes. This scenario made it clearer to the Romans that, despite having achieved a decisive victory, the instability of the territory still required the active presence of the legions. On the other hand, the Gauls still showed capacity for mobilization, but their political fragmentation, the difference in interests between the tribes and the difficulty of maintaining lasting alliances weakened them. Britain represented a different world, not completely disconnected from Gaul, as there were commercial exchanges and kinship ties between some Gallic and British tribes, but with its own characteristics. Caesar describes the Britons as populations divided into countless tribes, each led by independent leaders, often in conflict with each other. The power structure was not centralized, and only in moments of grave threat was a unified command sought. Cassivellaunus, who became the central figure of the resistance during the Second Roman expedition of 54 BC, emerges as a military leader rather than a ruler in the Roman sense of the term. Its role, according to what Caesar states, was recognized thanks to the prestige acquired in previous wars and the ability to organize a defense system against an enemy never faced before. The fact that he managed to gather various tribes from the southeastern part of Britain under his temporary authority, however, demonstrates the existence of cooperation mechanisms that could become effective if guided by charismatic personalities. The British army, or rather the tribal forces assembled to resist the invasion, had peculiar traits. Ancient sources, in particular Caesar, insist on the use of war chariots, an instrument that the Romans had not encountered for centuries and which aroused a certain surprise. British chariots combined mobility and shock capability. They carried warriors who could throw javelins or fight on the ground and who were then quickly recovered. This tactic, which partly recalled the archaic forms of warfare attributed to the Homeric heroes, was effective in a context of local clashes and fighting on terrain suitable for rapid maneuver, but showed clear limits when faced with a trained and disciplined army like the Roman one. Alongside the chariots, the Britons had numerous infantry, armed in various ways, with shields and spears, but without the standardization of the legions. Cavalry was present, but not with the same effectiveness as the Germanic or Gallic auxiliary cavalry that Caesar had already faced in other campaigns. The lack of uniform discipline and a stable military hierarchy was the real weakness of the British populations. On a political and social level, the British tribes had not developed structures comparable to those of the Gallic communities closer to the Mediterranean world. Cities were scarce, the economic organization was based mainly on agriculture and local exchange, and power was linked to the figure of the tribal leader or the king of small communities. Cassivellaunus, despite the temporary authority that was recognized to him, did not have an administrative apparatus capable of supporting a prolonged military effort. Caesar himself underlines how British resistance was based more on knowledge of the territory and the ability to escape the enemy than on decisive frontal clashes. This attitude, typical of populations who find themselves having to face an invader with technical superiority, highlights the distance between the Roman model and the British one. To understand the condition of Rome's enemies, it is necessary to parallel their situation with that of the Roman army in the same period. Caesar's legions, in 54 BC, were now made up of veterans who had faced tough and complex campaigns. Each legion was divided into cohorts and maniples, with a precise chain of command headed by the centurions, key figures who guaranteed discipline and continuity. Logistics, based on the construction of temporary fortifications and supplies through local resources, was refined to the point of allowing long movements in hostile territories without the army losing cohesion. The engineering skills, already demonstrated in the construction of the bridges over the Rhine and in the Alesia works, constituted an element that no enemy could match. The difference between the Romans and their opponents was not only technological, but also mental. Discipline, the ability to fight in tight formation, the readiness to build fortified camps at the end of each march, gave the Roman soldiers a sense of security and a psychological advantage that often decided the fate of the clashes. At the height of the Gallic Wars, Caesar had around 10 operational legions, although not all were involved in the expedition to Britain. The actual strength of each legion varied, but was around 4,500 to 5,000 men. Added to these were the auxiliary troops, often made up of Gallic or Germanic cavalry, which integrated the Roman heavy infantry with a mobile component essential for pursuits and reconnaissance. By comparison, the British forces may have been numerically superior, but their disparity and lack of coordination made them vulnerable. Roman sources tend to emphasize the difficulties encountered by the legions in the landing and in the early stages of operations, but implicitly recognize that once the compact formation had been established and their presence on the mainland consolidated, the Britons were unable to oppose effectively. A further element to consider in the state of the enemies is the economic dimension. Gaul, despite its divisions, had agricultural resources and commercial networks that allowed it to sustain relatively long military efforts. Britain, on the other hand, was less developed in terms of infrastructure and more isolated. Strabo, writing in the Augustan age, speaks of limited exports of products such as grain, livestock, slaves, and metals such as tin, but does not describe an economy capable of maintaining long-term armies. This partly explains why British resistance was episodic and relied on quick clashes and ambushes rather than sustained campaigns. On the Roman side, the army was not only a military instrument, but also a political and social one. The soldiers were linked to their commander by a personal relationship of loyalty and economic expectations. Caesar knew well that victories and spoils strengthened the loyalty of the troops and guaranteed their support even in the most politically delicate phases. The Roman army in Gaul and Britain was therefore not a neutral entity, but an integral part of the construction of Caesar's personal power. This element is fundamental to understand why the expeditions across the Rhine and the Channel were not only strategic operations, but also direct messages to public opinion and the Roman Senate. Suetonius, in the Life of Caesar, underlines how his ability to keep the army loyal was one of the secrets of his political success. The contrast between Rome and its enemies, therefore, was not balanced. On the one hand, there was a professional, disciplined army, with consolidated logistics and commanded by an experienced general. On the other, there were numerous populations, combative, but divided and without adequate organizational tools. Cassivellaunus represented the closest attempt at unified leadership, but its authority could not compare with that which Caesar exercised over his legions. The disparity in resources, discipline, and strategy made it inevitable that, despite initial difficulties, the British campaign would end with a Roman victory at least on a political and symbolic level. Contemporary sources, although filtered from Caesar's perspective, allow us to grasp the reality of this disproportion and to understand how the state of Rome's enemies, although based on courage and tenacity, was insufficient to counter a military and political machine that was now taking on imperial dimensions. After the submission of Gaul and the repression of the last pockets of resistance, Julius Caesar found himself faced with the need to consolidate his authority and confirm Roman dominion also through actions that went beyond traditional territorial limits. The advance towards Britain was therefore not a sudden or isolated gesture, but the result of a chain of events and strategic calculations that matured over the years 56 to 54 BC. Britain was only partially known through reports from merchants and stories coming from the Gallic coasts. Caesar himself, in the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, admits that before his expedition the news was vague and often contradictory, so much so that he had to resort to explorers and prisoners to gather information on the populations, leaders, and landing ports. Subsequent sources, such as Strabo and Dio Cassius, enriched the narrative with geographical and anecdotal details, but there is no doubt that at the time of the decision, knowledge was limited and the expedition also had the aim of exploring and mapping an almost unknown territory. One of the factors that led Caesar to look to Britain was the realization that many Gallic tribes were receiving support or refuge from across the Channel. The existence of ties between the peoples of the two shores was known, and some prisoners confirmed the presence of flows of weapons and mercenaries. In this sense, the expedition took on a preventive nature. Striking Britain meant isolating the most hostile Gallic tribes and cutting off external supply channels. But there was also an internal political aspect. Caesar needed to strengthen his image in Rome, where the echo of his victories was the main tool for maintaining consensus. Bringing the Roman army to a never-conquered land had enormous propaganda value, capable of exalting his figure and placing him above other contemporary generals. Suetonius, in the Life of Caesar, clearly underlines how his audacity was considered almost legendary for having dared the crossing that none of his predecessors had ever attempted. The logistical difficulties were immediate. The English Channel, with its changing tides and winds, represented a very different obstacle to the rivers and mountains faced until then. The first expedition, in 55 BC, demonstrated how unprepared the Roman fleet was to handle those conditions. The ships, built to carry troops along rivers or short coastal stretches, were not suited to open, unstable waters. A sudden storm damaged most of the boats and forced Caesar to hastily reorganize the return. However, even that uncertain outcome was presented as a test of strength, since the legions had managed to land, fight and leave again without suffering a defeat. For the second expedition, in 54 BC, the preparations were much more careful. Caesar ordered the construction of a larger number of ships, adapted to the characteristics of the channel, lower to facilitate landings and wider to ensure stability. It was a notable technical and organizational effort that demonstrated the Roman ability to learn from experience and innovate quickly. At the same time, the Britons were also preparing. The news of the first expedition and the clashes with the legions had alarmed the tribes of the southern part of the island. Cassivellaunus, who already had a reputation as a skilled and feared leader, was chosen as leader of the resistance. His authority was recognized especially in the region north of the Thames, and his appointment as military leader shows that the Britons were able to at least temporarily overcome tribal rivalries in the face of a common threat. Caesar states that Cassivellaunus had waged wars against other tribes and that his military prowess made him best suited to lead a coalition. His forces were largely composed of light infantry, cavalry, and the famous war chariots, used to disorientate enemies and to strike quickly in multiple points. British tactics, according to Caesar, were based on mobility and the psychological effect of a sudden attack, rather than on the ability to sustain a prolonged pitched battle. On the Roman front, the organization was very different. Caesar gathered 5 legions for the second expedition, accompanied by a considerable number of allied Gallic knights. Before leaving, he had the ports on the coast of Gaul secured and set up warehouses of grain and supplies. Logistics was a crucial aspect. A Roman army could not survive without constant supplies, and transportation across the sea carried considerable risks. The legionaries were trained to board quickly and maintain order even in adverse conditions, aware that the disembarkation phase was the most delicate. The sources insist on the discipline of the legions, which represented the main guarantee of success. The passage towards Britain took place at the height of the summer season, when conditions were more favorable, but there were no shortage of difficulties. Navigating such a large fleet required coordination and precise signals to stay on course. Storms and currents scattered some ships, forcing Caesar to reorganize the formation several times. Even in this case, however, the Roman ability to maintain cohesion prevailed. Once they reached the coast, the Britons put up immediate resistance, trying to prevent the landing. Caesar describes the difficulty of the legionaries who, weighed down by their weapons, had to advance in the water while the enemies attacked them from land. It was thanks to the action of the soldiers of the more experienced cohorts and the determination of the eagle-bearers, the bearers of the insignia, that the landing was completed and the legions were able to establish a first fortified camp. British preparations were not limited to the coastal clash. Cassivellaunus organized a series of ambushes and rapid attacks, exploiting his knowledge of the territory and the support of the local tribes. Caesar admits in the Commentarii that the Romans encountered difficulties in moving in an unknown environment, lacking the roads and infrastructure present in Gaul. Forests, rivers, and muddy terrain constituted natural obstacles that slowed the advance. The Britons aimed to wear down the army, hitting convoys and isolating small detachments. To counter these tactics, Caesar kept the legions compact and had fortifications built whenever possible, minimizing the risks of being caught by surprise. The march towards the Thames, which constituted the heart of the campaign, was therefore preceded by a series of approach maneuvers, reconnaissance, and minor clashes which put both sides to the test. The Romans progressively adapted to the terrain and exploited their engineering skills to overcome waterways and swamps. The Britons, led by Cassivellaunus, sought to delay the enemy, counting on the fact that logistical difficulties and losses might force Caesar to retreat. Despite their determination, however, they were unable to prevent the advance towards the river, where the main confrontation would be decided. The preparations for the battle were therefore the result of a dual effort. On the one hand, the Roman meticulousness, made up of logistics, discipline, and organization; on the other, the British resistance, based on mobility, knowledge of the territory, and guerrilla tactics. The available sources, although written largely by Roman authors, suggest that the clash on the Thames was not the result of a chance encounter, but the conclusion of a series of planned moves and counter-moves. Caesar could not have afforded failure, knowing that his political prestige was at stake. Cassivellaunus could not abandon the tribes that had recognized him as leader without fighting. The clash was therefore inevitable, prepared by weeks of tension, maneuvers, and opposing strategies. The chronology of the battles that led to the clash on the Thames in 54 BC cannot be understood without following step by step the advance of the Roman legions and the defense maneuvers implemented by the British tribes. Caesar's Commentarii de Bello Gallico remain the main source for reconstructing those events, although their propagandistic nature requires a critical reading. It is precisely thanks to Caesar's narration that we can grasp the tactical details, the logistical difficulties, the turning points, and the evolution of the clash, while subsequent authors such as Cassius Dio or Strabo provide useful interpretations or additions but always filtered by temporal distance. After the landing, described as particularly difficult due to the resistance offered by the coastal forces and the unfavorable conditions, the Roman army found itself having to consolidate its positions. The first clashes were skirmishes and sudden attacks carried out by the Britons, who tried to exploit the mobility of the cavalry and war chariots to destabilize the cohorts during the march. Caesar underlines the difficulty for his men to face an enemy who retreated rapidly after each blow, avoiding pitched battle and preferring a strategy of attrition. To counter this type of warfare, the legions adopted a slow and methodical pace, building fortified camps at the end of each day and always keeping the formations compact. An important episode occurred during the crossing of a minor watercourse, when the Britons attempted to take the Roman troops by surprise. On that occasion, according to Caesar, it was the readiness of the centurions and the discipline of the cohorts that prevented the disaster. The legionaries, despite fighting with water up to their knees and under the pressure of frontal and lateral attacks, managed to maintain the line, demonstrating once again the superiority of the manipulative formation transformed into a cohort. This type of episode shows the tactical nature of the campaign. The Romans never found themselves faced with a large pitched battle in the traditional sense, but rather with a series of clashes and local resistance which finally culminated in the barrage organized by Cassivellaunus on the Thames. The march towards the river was punctuated by ambushes, which however failed to stop the advance. Cassivellaunus had prepared the land in order to make the most of the natural conditions. The Thames constituted a formidable line of defense, and the British leader ordered the banks to be fortified with sharp stakes driven into the riverbed and hidden below the water level. This information comes to us from Caesar, who describes with a certain pride the discovery of the deception and the legion's ability to overcome it. The use of underwater obstacles represents one of the few traces of ingenious tactics on the part of the Britons, who demonstrated that they knew how to exploit the terrain and available resources despite not having the engineering skills of the Romans. The chronology of the main clash is therefore concentrated on the crossing of the Thames. The legions advanced resolutely, despite the obvious risk. Caesar ordered the cavalry to wade first into some shallower places, followed by the heavy infantry. The eagle-bearers, bearers of the legionary insignia, threw themselves into the water first, a gesture that served to encourage the soldiers and maintain high cohesion. The Britons, deployed on the other bank, tried to repel the advance with showers of javelins and assaults from war chariots. The image that emerges from the Commentarii is that of a moment of great tension, in which Roman discipline was opposed to British fury and speed. Eventually the legionaries managed to reach the shore and break through the enemy lines. The psychological effect of the impact of the compact cohorts was devastating. The Roman cavalry, supported by the Gallic allies, pursued the retreating Britons, transforming a risky fight into a victory. The role of war chariots, so emphasized by Caesar, deserves tactical reflection. They were used to bring warriors close to the enemy, allowing them to dismount and fight, then remount and quickly move away. It was a tactic that exploited speed and surprise, but which proved ineffective against an enemy arranged in a compact formation and armed with javelins. The Romans quickly learned not to chase the chariots, maintaining discipline and waiting for the moment when the British warriors came down to fight, when the superiority of the Roman heavy infantry clearly emerged. Thus the chronology of the skirmishes sees an alternation of rapid attacks and British retreats followed by methodical Roman advances. The Thames episode, however, marked the turning point. The coalition led by Cassivellaunus was no longer able to stop the advance and was forced to switch to guerrilla warfare and attempts at attrition rather than new frontal battles. An important aspect of the operations was the role of the auxiliary cavalry, composed largely of allied Gauls. The Commentarii mention the contribution of these knights in repelling flank attacks and pursuing the fleeing Britons. This element highlights how the war in Britain was not conducted by the Romans alone, but was the result of a larger coalition in which the subjugated Gallic populations provided men and resources. The chronology of the operations, therefore, cannot be read only as a comparison between Rome and the Britons, but also as the demonstration of the new balance established in Gaul. The tribes that had fought against Caesar a few years earlier were now at his side, contributing to the conquest of new lands. After the victory at the Thames crossing, Cassivellaunus adopted a different strategy. He avoided direct clash and tried to exploit the terrain to hit convoys and isolated garrisons. Caesar, however, maintained the cohesion of the legions and continued the march, devastating the territories loyal to Cassivellaunus and trying to force the Britons into a political surrender. The chronology of the following weeks shows a slow wear and tear of British resistance, culminating in the moment in which Cassivellaunus, cornered and betrayed by the defections of some tribes, was forced to ask for peace. On a tactical level, the clash on the Thames demonstrates the contrast between two concepts of war. On the one hand, the Roman one, based on discipline, engineering, and the ability to face even the most adverse conditions without losing cohesion. On the other, the British one, based on mobility, speed, and knowledge of the terrain. Caesar won because he was able to impose his method and reduce the effectiveness of enemy tactics. The sources allow us to imagine the battle not as a single sudden event, but as a sequence of linked episodes, in which each Roman advance and each British resistance were part of a game of moves and countermoves. Cassius Dio, writing in the Severian Age, interprets the campaign as a demonstration of strength rather than a conquest, and this reading appears consistent with reality. Caesar was not aiming for a lasting occupation, but for a rapid and symbolic success that would strengthen his prestige. The analysis of the chronology of the battles with attention to tactics, therefore, allows us to understand the peculiar character of the British campaign. It was not a war of sieges and great pitched battles as in Gaul, but a campaign of movement, difficult crossings, local resistance, and continuous adaptation. The Romans were able to transform a hostile environment into a political and military victory, while the Britons, despite showing courage and inventiveness, were unable to overcome the structural limits of their organization. The Roman victory on the Thames in 54 BC marked a decisive moment in the expedition to Britain, but did not represent the definitive conclusion of the operations. After the breach of the defensive line and the dispersion of the forces led by Cassivellaunus, Caesar found himself faced with the task of translating a tactical success into a stable political result. The impact of the battle was twofold. On the one hand, it established the indisputable superiority of the Roman legions in direct confrontation. On the other, it made it clear that a prolonged occupation of the island would have been complex and probably unsustainable. The Commentarii de Bello Gallico tell how Caesar, after having repelled his adversaries and consolidated the positions beyond the Thames, decided to conduct a series of targeted devastations in the allied territories of Cassivellaunus, with the aim of weakening their resistance and inducing the British tribes to separate from their leader. This strategy, typical of Roman warfare, did not aim so much at military annihilation as at the disintegration of the enemy's political front. Caesar knew well that the strength of the Britons lay in their ability to maintain a temporary alliance under the guidance of a recognized leader. Breaking that fragile coalition meant winning without having to multiply pitched battles. And indeed the result arrived. Several tribes, including those located in the southern part of the island, preferred to negotiate with the Romans rather than risk the ruin of their territories. In this sense, the campaign took on a diplomatic as well as military character, and Roman supremacy was expressed not only through weapons but also through economic and psychological pressure. Cassivellaunus, aware that he could not sustain a war of attrition for long against a more organized opponent, tried to weaken the Romans by attacking their supplies. He ordered his men to attack the convoys and burn the countryside that could provide grain to the enemy army. However, Caesar managed to keep the logistics chain intact thanks to the deposits prepared on the coast and the help of the Gallic tribes who remained faithful. One of the most significant moments was Cassivellaunus' attempt to stir up a revolt among the people of Kent against the Roman camp that guarded the ships. According to Caesar's narration, for local kings, identified by the names of Cingetorix, Carvillo, Taximagulo, and Segivase, attempted an assault with their forces but were repelled with heavy losses. This episode demonstrates how, despite not being able to prevail in the open field, the Britons tried to inflict a decisive blow against the most vulnerable point of the Roman device, the fleet and coastal supplies. The failure of the attack marked a heavy blow for the resistance and pushed Cassivellaunus to seek the path of negotiation. The conditions imposed by Caesar were relatively moderate, which demonstrates the limited nature of the expedition. Cassivellaunus had to undertake not to undertake new hostilities against the neighboring tribes who had sided with Rome, to deliver hostages as collateral and to pay an annual tribute. However, there was no formal annexation of Britain nor the installation of permanent garrisons. Later sources, notably Cassius Dio, observe that the expedition had more symbolic than territorial value, as Caesar did not have the means or time to establish lasting control. He himself was aware that the continuation of operations in Britain would have compromised his position in Gaul, where the ferment of rebellion had not yet completely subsided. The outcome of the battle on the Thames therefore had immediate and long-term consequences. Immediately, it strengthened Caesar's prestige both among his soldiers and in Rome. The image of a general capable of leading legions beyond known borders and imposing his authority on a barbarian king beyond the sea was cleverly exploited in his political propaganda. Suetonius, in the Life of Caesar, recalls how the name of Cassivellaunus became known among the Romans thanks to this confrontation, symbol of a victory that transcended traditional geographical boundaries. In the long term, the expedition set a precedent that would inspire future plans to conquer the island, until the systematic invasion undertaken under Claudius almost a century later. In other words, although it was not a stable conquest, the campaign of 54 BC opened the way to a perception of Britain as a land destined to enter the Roman orbit. From a military point of view, the victory demonstrated the legion's ability to adapt to new environmental conditions and tactics. The overcoming of the underwater obstacles set up on the Thames and the management of the assaults of the British war chariots are episodes that show the Roman flexibility in the face of unusual techniques. The Britons, for their part, revealed courage and inventiveness, but the lack of centralized organization and discipline comparable to the Roman one proved fatal. The chronology of the clashes shows how the Britons were gradually forced to retreat and modify their tactics, moving from attempts at frontal battles to dispersive guerrilla warfare which, however, was not enough to reverse the course of events. It is important to note that Caesar could not maintain his position in Britain for long. Logistical difficulties, the arrival of winter and the need to return to Gaul to face new threats forced him to retreat shortly after imposing his conditions at Cassivellaunus. The expedition therefore lasted a few weeks, and the Romans left no permanent garrisons. This does not mean that the psychological impact on the local population was strong. The British king who had dared to oppose Rome had been forced to submit, at least formally, and the tribes had learned that the Roman army could reach them even beyond the sea. Strabo, in his geography, observes that after Caesar's expeditions, commercial relations with Britain increased and that the island entered the Roman trade circuit more steadily. In this sense, the victory on the Thames also had economic consequences, paving the way for an intensification of relations which, although not based on direct dominion, marked a growing influence of Rome. The analysis of the consequences must also consider the internal Roman point of view. In Rome, the news of Caesar's victories were welcomed with enthusiasm and further strengthened his political prestige, already consolidated by the Gallic campaigns. However, the lack of a lasting conquest in Britain left room for criticism from some opponents, who pointed out that the expedition had produced more hype than concrete results. This ambivalence is reflected in subsequent historiographical evidence. While for some Caesar appears as the bold conqueror who had pushed the Roman borders beyond all known limits, for others he remains the man who had led a demonstration expedition without consolidating it with a permanent occupation. Despite these ambiguities, the campaign of 54 BC marked a point of no return in the perception of Britain. The Thames, daringly overcome by the legions, was no longer an insurmountable barrier but a river crossed and conquered. The outcome of the battle and subsequent operations sanctioned Roman success in political, psychological, and propaganda terms, even if not in territorial terms. Cassivellaunus survived as a resistance figure, but his authority was weakened, and the British tribes understood the difficulty of standing together against an adversary like Rome. From that moment, the island remained in an ambiguous position for decades, formally independent but inevitably attracted into the Roman sphere of influence, until the imperial policy of the 1st century AD decided to transform that influence into conquest. After the conclusion of the British campaign in 54 BC, Julius Caesar found himself faced with the need to extract the maximum political and strategic result from that expedition, even without having established permanent bases on the island. The outcome of the battle on the Thames and the subsequent operations, which forced Cassivellaunus to surrender and accept the payment of tribute and the delivery of hostages, had provided Caesar with sufficient material to consolidate his prestige. However, he was fully aware that his work in Britain had been more demonstrative than structural, and that the real challenge remained in Gaul, where new rebellions and hostile movements were already announced. In the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, he dedicates ample space to the description of the expedition, presenting it as an exemplary victory that demonstrated the invincibility of the legions, but in practice he hastened to return to the continent, a clear sign that the campaign could not continue without excessive risks. The return to Gaul took place in the middle of autumn, after the situation across the Channel had been formally settled. Caesar had the damaged ships repaired and organized the embarkation of the troops, avoiding leaving permanent detachments in Britain. This choice clearly reveals that the general saw the expedition not as a long-term objective, but as a temporary stage in his broader strategy. The sea that separated the island from the continent was in fact not only a natural obstacle but also a political barrier. Maintaining a permanent garrison would have required resources and men that he could not afford to take away from the legions engaged on the Gallic front. Strabo, in the Geography, observes that after the Caesarian campaigns, relations with Britain intensified above all on a commercial level, and this data confirms that the most concrete effect of the expedition was not the occupation but the opening of more regular channels of exchange and influence. The immediate results were therefore primarily of a political and propagandistic nature. In Rome, the news of the crossing of the sea and the submission of a British king was welcomed with enthusiasm, and Caesar was able to add a further piece to his image of a victorious general and a man destined to overcome the traditional limits of the residential publica. Suetonius recalls how Caesar's fame increased to the point that his campaigns were perceived not only as military exploits but as events that broadened the very horizon of the Romans. Cassius Dio, writing many centuries later, confirms that the impression made by the British expeditions was enormous and that they were regarded as the sign of unprecedented audacity. Indeed, the simple fact that a Roman army had crossed the Channel and fought victoriously on an island hitherto considered distant and almost mythical was enough to consolidate Caesar's personal legend. From the British point of view, the outcomes were more complex. Cassivellaunus, although defeated, maintained his role as regional leader, but his authority was weakened by the fact that he had to bow to Roman conditions. The tribes that had lined up against him instead consolidated relations with Caesar and Rome, creating a rift that would influence the politics of the island in the following years. The absence of a Roman garrison did not mean that Britain was forgotten. Roman influence manifested itself through trade contacts, diplomatic relations, and the widespread perception that the power of the legions could reach even the most remote regions. In this sense, the tribute imposed on Cassivellaunus and the delivery of hostages were symbolic instruments, rather than economic, which testified to the subordination of the Britons to the will of Rome, even if only formally. On a military level, the expedition had the merit of testing the ability of the legions to face new conditions. The experience gained in crossing the Channel, managing the landings and countering the tactics of the British war chariots provided lessons that would be useful in the future. Roman discipline, The ability to quickly build fortifications and the readiness of commanders were the elements that allowed potentially insurmountable difficulties to be transformed into victories. The Commentarii do not fail to underline these aspects, also because the function of the text was precisely to exalt the efficiency and superiority of the army. However, if we look at the campaign as a whole, the awareness also emerges that Rome was not yet ready for a stable occupation. The impending winter, the need to maintain cohesion in Gaul and limited resources forced Caesar to consider the expedition as concluded. The preparation of the next phase of his military policy was therefore aimed at Gaul. As soon as he returned, Caesar had to face increasingly evident signs of discontent, which would materialize shortly afterwards in the Great Revolt led by Vercingetorix in 52 BC. In this sense, the British campaign can be seen as a parenthesis, useful for strengthening Caesar's image but not decisive for the stability of his rule. Indeed, some historians have underlined how the general's absence, even if only temporary, encouraged the Gauls to reorganize. It is therefore probable that Caesar himself was aware of the fragility of his position, and that for this reason he limited the duration of the expedition. The overall results of the campaign can be summarized in three distinct plans. On a military level, it was a clear but limited victory, which demonstrated the adaptability of the legions and their ability to defeat an enemy in unfavorable conditions, but which did not translate into permanent control of the territory. On a political level, Caesar managed to obtain the maximum advantage, presenting the expedition as a triumph that broadened the horizon of Roman power and thus strengthened its position against internal adversaries. On a diplomatic and economic level, Britain entered permanently into the orbit of Rome, not through annexation but through a system of influences, tributes, and commercial relationships that would prepare its future conquest. In conclusion, Caesar's British campaign represents one of the most significant episodes of his career, not so much for its territorial results but for its symbolic value and indirect consequences. It demonstrated that Roman power had no geographical limits, that the legions could cross seas and face unknown peoples, and that the figure of Caesar himself was destined to be perceived as that of a universal general. Ancient sources agree in recognizing this undertaking as having an emblematic value. Caesar, although retreating, left behind him the idea of a Rome capable of extending its influence beyond the sea, thus preparing the ground for future campaigns of the imperial age. The next phase of his action would take place again in Gaul, culminating in the repression of Vercingetorix's revolt and the victory of Alesia, but the echo of the British expedition did not die out and remained an integral part of his political and military legend.